All right, we should now be live. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone, for Something Queer is happening up in space, space operas. If you are in the wrong place, now is the time to switch windows and find your correct location. But if you are in the right place, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. We are going to give just a minute or so for people to wander in, get comfortable, get situated before we begin our discussion and introductions and whatnot. So please pull up a chair, pull up a cat, pull up whatever you have available in terms of food and beverages, and we hope that you enjoy our conversation. What we will be doing is we will be asking some questions initially. There will be discussion among the panelists, and then we will open up to Q&A in about the last 15 minutes. So feel free to put any questions that you have in the Q&A, and we will hopefully be able to get to as many of them as possible. But otherwise, again, thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us. And now it's been, I hope, enough time. So I'm going to get started with the introductions. All right, Arkady Martine is a speculative fiction writer and as Dr. Anna Linden Weller, a historian of the Byzantine Empire and a city planner. Under both names, she writes about border politics, rhetoric, propaganda, and the edges of the world. Arkady grew up in New York City and after some time in Turkey, Canada, and Sweden, lives in New Mexico with her wife, the author Vivian Shaw. Martine's debut novel, A Memory Called Empire, kicks off the Texcalan series. You can find her online at www.arkadymartine.net and on Twitter as Arkady Martine, with the @ sign in front of it, of course. Everina Maxwell is the author of Winter's Orbit, a queer romantic space opera about a diplomat who enters into an arranged marriage to save his planet. She grew up in Sussex, UK, and now lives and works in Yorkshire. She first took part in NaNoWriMo in 2004 and continues to precariously balance writing, a day job, and watching Let's Plays of video games she claims she doesn't have time to play. As a person who does Let's Plays of video games, I appreciate that. We need to have audience members. I am your moderator for today, Valerie Valdes. I am the author of space opera's Chilling Effect and Prime Deceptions. The third book, Fault Tolerance, will be out next year. Found family space opera with psychic cats and a lot of shenanigans. So thank you again so much for coming. And let's jump right into our questions. All right. So first question for the panelists. What elements of space opera make you want to write stories in the genre? We will start with, we'll go with Arkady first this time.
So I love space opera because it's huge in scope. You can get so much into it. I mean, I write science fiction when I'm not actively trying to write something else. It's kind of the default for me. But my love of space opera partially comes from feeling that you can mix vast vistas and politics and space warfare and technology and social movements, and just there's so much room inside it. And like, I love politics in general and writing them. So when I was picking a genre that felt good to write in, this was an easy pick.
That's awesome. Everina?
Yeah, I think that's I think my answer would be pretty much the same. I think the infinite expanse of space is a huge drawing point for a lot of science fiction, I think, particularly for space opera. I think there's a sense for me that space opera is a genre where you can tell a story about something other than the fact we are 400 years in the future or 2,000 years in the future, however you want to kind of put that. I think there's a feeling for me that you can take a focus on, you're focusing on an aspect of politics or an aspect of warfare or an aspect of character work or kind of more intimate court or town politics. And you are doing it in a different place from our world. You're not pinning it in history. You're not pinning it in, I think even when you're writing fantasy, there is more of a feeling that you have to pin it at a certain technology level, which brings implications for what the reader then thinks is happening in the rest of the world. And with space opera, by freeing yourself from that kind of point in time, by saying, okay, X centuries in the future, you can have a kind of slightly freer canvas, a slightly different way of looking at things. So yeah, I think that freedom is the draw for space opera.
That is awesome. So I may circle back around to some of those answers, but we'll dive into the second question, which is related to the topic of the panel. How does queerness permeate and inform the characters and worlds and conflicts of your stories as they are within the space opera genre? We'll go with Everina to start, and then Arkady. We'll just go back and forth like that.
Fair enough.
So I think everyone on this panel is familiar with and has worked in the concept of a queer norm world, which is the idea that you just assume that being queer is fine. You just assume that that is a state we have reached in the future of this timeline, and you are then playing in a world which you're not having to balance homophobia and your characters. You can just say, well, my characters are queer, and then what happens next? I think once you have got to that state of, okay, well, same-sex relationships, it's fine, you then start delving into gender quite deeply, and there's no way to decouple a deeper examination of gender from, well, same-sex relationships are okay. There's no way to say, you have gay marriage or whatever, but all the gender norms are still there. So I think that then becomes, sometimes you could assume that everyone writing a queer norm world is writing it in the same way because they're writing a world without homophobia, but because you have this absolutely like mandatory coupling with you have to examine gender now, and you have to come up with some answers for some stuff there isn't answers for, that means you have this kind of enormous fractal multiplication of what queer norm worlds come out as. I think that's really interesting, and I think there's a lot more room in the genre to do more with that.
I completely agree with you. When I was building Tixcalan, I wanted to do a queer norm world, and I started with that as an assumption, like, okay, that's just going to be how it is. And in working through what that meant in the universe I had created, actually the place where I first had to kind of fractally unpick what that would imply was, how do people have children? In what fashion? And part of what I wanted to do with that was to make the having of children not biologically dependent. So it could be something that people could choose to do or not do as they liked, and it really didn't matter whether they could do so within their own bodies or would require a external technological facility to do so. So that ended up being that, okay, I'm going to default to artificial wombs for everybody. And I got to play with this with a particular character in both books. She's a side character, and she happens to have embarked on the project of having a baby with a uterus. And this is considered to be a little bit like running an ultra marathon in her culture. Like, okay, that's a thing you decided to do there that is really physically difficult and slightly dangerous and has a bit of a small amount of prejudice against, actually, mostly people thinking, well, wow, that child turned out really well for being grown inside a person. So that was the first place that I kind of realized what the assumption of a queer norm world might do. And then, having thought about that, I wanted to really think about what else I meant when I was working through gender and sexuality in the relationships between people. And I think I ended up, at least for the Tixcalanli culture, settling on a gender is a thing people have. Some people are super into it. Most people have got one, like hairstyles. and they may matter enormously to people and be part of a personal identity, but that's less common because it's kind of a stylistic factor more than, I mean, I would feel very strange with different hair, but I would also feel very strange with a different gender. Like I'm very cisgendered as a person. So like, which has, I think, made me think a lot about gender in my daily life because I have so many awesome friends who are trans. And like, okay, is this a default or is it something I really love? And coming to that place with my own gender of, yeah, I really love the gender I got assigned at birth. That's awesome and hurrah for me. And other people don't. That's awesome and hurrah for them. So I wanted that space to be wide open in the books so that it was not, I don't think I'm very interested in writing about homophobia, basically, or transphobia, or constraining character action because of sexual orientation or gender expression.
Yeah, would you like to say more, Everina? Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, lots of interesting points there. Yeah, I would really agree with all of that. Starting with the last point of, I'm personally not interested in writing about homophobia, which is not to say that that is not a thing which sci-fi cannot do and cannot do really well. And there are lots of amazing books in that genre. But me personally, on one level, the idea of a queer non-world is a fantasy. But I was also really interested in what you were saying about when you start to unpick something, lots of other things unravel that you weren't quite expecting. And I think you start with, you know, two people of the same gender marrying each other. And then I also immediately got to, okay, children. I also immediately landed on artificial wombs, I think because Bujob was very formative for me.
Me
too. Excellent, let's talk about Bujob later. I then ended up having a very deep conversation with my girlfriend, who is a doctor and understands genetics, about how genetics might work. And I ended up with this thing of, well, in this culture, you have people basically donating chromosome pairs for no real medical reason because it has become a social thing. Because originally in the original colony, you had limited people, you need to screen for genetic diseases, so you could swap out problem chromosomes from healthy donors. And implications of that aside, you then have this thing where you have a social thing of, okay, each child has a whole lot of gifters and they have gifted genetic material that is not necessarily important, but is now a kind of social, almost like godfather, godmother-esque bond with the child. And you have this thing of, okay, that's now a point in this planet's culture, but this planet doesn't have it. And then you get to do this almost kind of, a bit like your thing of running an ultramarathon, this kind of slightly comedic, like gentle societal judgment of something which doesn't happen in our own world, which I find a really interesting source for comedy. Because then you have this thing of, well, this child has been gifted genes by someone who is very, very unlike them, and that then becomes a source for comedy later in the book. I love that you can just shift everything like 2 steps over, and then you suddenly have a whole different set of societal norms that you then get to play with.
I mean, this is the magic of space opera, like very precisely. It's, you get to, by doing that shift, the 2-step sideways shift, you can look at a social phenomenon that does exist in our current world, but you can look at it through a different lens and you can point it differently. You can shift it comedic, or you can shift it like deeply disturbing, either way, however you want to do. And by taking that 2-step sideways jump, you can decouple it from its current associations. And I always think of this, and less about gender in my books than more about questions of imperialism, which is a whole different panel. But I always want the knife of the book to be sharp enough to hurt, but not so sharp that it wounds. And taking those 2 steps away is one of the ways that I think about approaching that it's not a direct reflection of something that people would find in the world, that they recognize as their own, but is so clearly analogous, and the process of approaching it is familiar, So you can look at it in a kind of isolation. And that's one of the reasons I love far future stuff in general, is you can do that kind of, let's look at a thing, a social thing, a technological thing, in a type of isolation. Explode it out.
Yeah, that actually leads, I think, pretty well into our next question. So we can even keep talking a little bit about stuff like this. But how the next question being, there's an adage about how sci-fi often says more about the time it was written in than the future it describes. So would you both like to talk about what your stories say about our present, but then also our possible futures? And again, some of that has been covered now, but Everina, you want to start on this one?
Yeah, So I am definitely of the school that this is in many ways a fantasy, that actually we cannot meaningfully understand the technology shifts that will take place in the next, say, 2,000 years, that will make our lives what they are in 2,000 years. I don't think the current state of things would have been imaginable to someone living at like NBC. In some ways it would have been, of course, like, and we can always look back and say, oh yeah, we have always been humans. But I think genuinely the technology changes are so much that they could not be encompassed back then, and that equally we cannot encompass them ourselves. So I think it's a fantasy, and that's where I'm starting off. So in that case, I very much agree with the premise of the question, that we are not so much doing things written in the future as things we are currently thinking about writ large, and written on a scale which is at a similar or imaginable technology level, but not with current politico-social environment. And I think because the only other option for that is, of course, an alternate current timeline. But every time you write an alternate current timeline, you are very much commenting on the kind of politico-social landscape by dint of what you're including or you're not including. The only way to kind of step sideways is to say, well, I'm going forward, but in fact, you're not going forward. This is not necessarily a picture of the future. I think a lot of what I'm dealing with in the book, I think is about queerness, it's about gender. I think a lot of what I'm thinking about, as well, is telling a good story, to be honest. I think you unpick the stuff in your head and you do a lot of world building, and sometimes it just remains in the background, because what you are trying to do is kind of tap into that catharsis of, I want to tell this story, and I want to tell a very kind of intense version of these other pieces I'm arranging in the background. But I know, but to be honest, Arkady is probably a better person to answer this, because your world is deeper and I think more epic in scale.
The weird thing is, I am not one of those people who does a ton of sort of pre-writing world building at all. I mostly work off of a aesthetic sense that I then make sure that I don't break any of my own rules. So, I mean, the whole setup of the large-scale political plot in A Memory Called Empire, at least, of the tiny station and the big empire that is encroaching both culturally and possibly physically on that tiny station, that is pulled 1000% from Byzantium and Armenia in the 11th century. And I wanted that feeling, that particular balance that I knew from the time I had spent as a historian of that area and that era. So I had to make certain choices about, say, faster than light travel, which recreated conditions on the ground. So the whole thing I've done with jump gates, with like these very narrow passages, they're just medieval mountain passes that you can't get through quickly. I mean, that's why I did it. So, I mean, to get back to the center of the question, I'm terrified of ever being called a futurist. I don't think I'm competent to be one. And I say that as someone who is actively working in imagining very nearby futures. My day job is in energy and climate policy. And that means that I'm spending a whole lot of time thinking 5 years, 10 years, 20 years into the future. What do we want that to look like? How do we get there? And that is such a completely different process than what I do as a writer, except in the sense of thinking about how people react to things, which cross-pollinates real well. So what I can say is that the level of complexity which I may have managed to create for Texcalan, which doesn't have a fixed point in the future, it's just really far away, if it's connected to Earth at all, and I don't know, and it's never been important whether there's an Earth in that universe. That level of complexity is fairly complex, and it holds 0 candles to the actual world. The level of complexity of trying to predict what might happen a year from now is so fantastically, horrifically difficult that I basically feel like when you're writing science fiction, and space opera is one of the places this is, for me at least, the easiest place to do it, what you're doing is expanding the possibility space. You're not making a prediction. You're saying, okay, given X, what thousands of Ys might happen. And that can push open sort of a sociological overton window where there's just more ideas of what the future could look like, both good and bad, so you can like pull away from things you want to avoid. And that doesn't have to be linked directly to a stepwise progression, like in the year X, this will happen and that will cause this. My current project that I'm working on is set in a specific place, in a specific time in the future of Earth, and that is one of the hardest things about it for me. Because I am absolutely sure that I am going to screw it up somehow. So, yeah.
And yet how could you? Because you're making it up. So, I mean, you're controlling the parameters. So it's true within the scope of what you've done.
Sort of. I mean, when I think about this, it's like the logic has to hold, like if I want the feeling of the mountain pass, the logic has to hold if I've created jump gates. And then in the second book, A Desolation Called Peace, they become deeply important to the plot because of how they work. So for the novel I'm working on, which is called Prescribed Burn, which is set about 400-ish years in the future-ish, and sort of in LA, kinda. And I don't want to break any of the rules of the world that exists now and the history that has always been while projecting forward. And that's tricky. It gives me a lot of respect for people whose sort of native form is that form, is the near future science fiction. I think it's one of the most difficult ones.
Yeah. And then how do you project forward not just one culture, but the entire Earth full of cultures in all of their different forms and diversity, and what will each of them do and how will they react to things and so on? Yeah.
Cue absolute paralyzation.
Yes. It's like, how would I even organize that? Spreadsheets? Do either of you use spreadsheets in any of this or no? That's a hard pass.
I don't even outline.
Well, but we discussed actually prior how your process is more of a kind of a slow writing, getting things right process. So, yeah. Would either of you like to talk about that, about your process a little bit in terms of building stories, world building, or shall we skip to the next question?
I'm probably not much of a world builder. My world building tends to happen post facto. I'm in the slightly weird position of I wrote the story, I put it all online. I had some thoughts about world building. I have a very bad habit of keeping the world building thoughts in my head and not putting them in the Word document or in the story. And then I worked on it with a professional editor who asked me questions about, do you have thoughts on world building? I was like, yes, lots of thoughts on world building. Could they be in the book? Yes, I suppose they could be in the book if you really, really want them to be. So I have this weird situation where I have the novel that is published by Tor has a lot more world building than the original draft did, and many people have read both. So I think although I'm fairly unable to describe my world building process, it's possible there are quite a few other people out there who could describe it better than me. So that's where I am with world building, not very self-conscious about it.
I actually had a remarkably similar experience, though I had not posted the draft online, so I didn't have that aspect of it. But the version of A Memory Called Empire, which I sold to Tor, was a good 40,000 words shorter than the version that was published. And that was, my edit letter was 5 bullet points and an instruction, and the instruction was go write the rest of the book, Arkady. I love my editor. She's brilliant, and annoyingly, that was, in fact, the correct edit letter. The 5 bullet points described some of the things I should probably put in.
That must have been fun.
Has just posted in chat. Yes, so Ali gave me a rather kind edit letter with more points more guidance about how about this. But yeah, so ultimately, I think the lesson we've all taken is that the world building should be in the book.
Yes, it helps.
I think that is just a writer struggle, things being in your head and not ending up on the page, and then after the fact it's like, oh, I guess I should write that down, shouldn't I? All right, so then moving into the next question, because we're coming up on when we're going to start allowing audience Q&A, so folks start thinking about your questions, and we'll be getting to them presently. Do you feel like your work is in dialogue with the legacy of space operas of the past? And if so, how? And if not, kind of just what are you in dialogue with, if anything? I'll start with Arkady.
Yeah.
Okay. So yes, I do, absolutely. The biggest direct influence is actually C.J. Cherryh's Foreigner books, which it's a wonderful series that has been going. It's got like 26 or 27 books in it now. You can read the first 6, and that's like a good set of like the thing that I'm playing with. And they're still being published. There's one published this year, but the original ones were published in the late 80s, early 90s, I believe. And the situation that I've kind of latched onto is the ambassador in a strange land plot, with deeply and fundamentally important social and cultural misunderstanding between people, various kinds of people. In Cherryh's work, that happens to be between a group of aliens and humans, and I didn't go that far at that point, with memory at least. But that, I love C.J. Cherryh's work. Like, not just those books, but nearly all of her work is really important to me. And when I wanted to write a space opera, that was the stuff that was like floating around in my back brain. Plus some other things. I read Dune very, very early, and I'm always really pleased when people compare my work to Dune. I hope I've done some things better. But I also really hope that I've done anything as well as the scope and deep connection between politics, technology, resources, and plot that it's in Dune. I think it's gorgeous. And it's a big influence on the kind of books I want to write.
I somehow miss C.J. Cherryh, and I don't know how, but I literally did not know of the existence of these books until I got very into Anne Leckie, which published Ancillary Justice, and read interviews, and of course Anne Leckie cites C.J. Cherryh as an influence all over the place. At that point, I think I bought the first book. It's in my massive TBR somewhere, but I don't know how I missed it, because I think they were being published at or before the same time as I was in my big like sci-fi space opera phase, when I was quite young. And the authors that I was kind of mainlining at that point were Bujold and Anne McCaffrey, are probably my two biggest, like not old, but they're published over a long period of time, but my two most formative influences. I think, Arkady, you mentioned Bujold previously. I think it is worth digging into that. I think it's worth the thing that Bujold particularly taught me was that sci-fi can be character-centric, and that was just not something I had picked up on before. I think I had read a bunch of different sci-fi. I had read Dune as well. I'm very impressed with it. It didn't. The world stuck with me. The characters didn't. And I think no characters in sci-fi really stuck with me until I started Bujold. And I was like, wait, I really, really care about these people. Didn't know that was possible in sci-fi. Though of course it has been done by other people, but for me that was my jumping on point. And I think also Anne McCaffrey, who I will cite as, haven't gone back and read it in 20 years. Not sure it holds up. Bujold, I think, is more interesting and there's more to get into there. But again, I think Anne McCaffrey was a really good contrast for me from some of the Golden Age stuff. Again, these people are characters. They are allowed to do things. Women are allowed to do things. You are allowed to have a story that is not necessarily about the technology with the kind of characters as pawns, but they are people who are making decisions because they are people. So yeah, I think those are my two biggest. Arkady, I'm interested if you've ever encountered McCaffrey.
Oh yeah, I read a lot of McCaffrey as a kid. Like between like the ages of 9 and 13, I think I went through most of McCaffrey, and not just the Dragon Singer, etc. books, but God, the ones about the telepaths, which I loved at that age so much. And I mean, I don't think I had exactly the same experience as you're describing of this realization that the characters were possible to hook onto. That may have been because I came to both McCaffrey and Bujold after having read Guy Gabriel Kay. And Guy Gabriel Kay is intensely character-centric, and it's all about emotional beats and aesthetics. And if I have a secret deep stylistic influence, it's Tigana. If you want to get a secret code to everything I do. So I read Bujold relatively late. I think I discovered Bujold in college, early when I was 18 or 19, and devoured it. And I have reread it actually in my late 20s. I reread the whole sequence to see if I had different reactions, and I absolutely did. They were still good, but they were completely different. But I think that says how much Bujold really does work through the phases of a character's life believably, because reading the sequence of Miles Verkosigan when you're 29 and 30 is very different than reading Miles Verkosigan when you're 19. The point at which you have the, oh God, am I like that, is distinctly different. It didn't help that at the time when I was 30, I was in the process of swapping careers and meeting my wife. Yeah.
And then me as the set lady, reading Cordelia and being like, yeah, mom stuff. All right, cool.
But the character-driven science fiction and fantasy, I think, is the common thread here. The place where, and this is one of the things I love about the genre right now, is that character-driven work is not a default, but is extremely normal and common in almost every genre. And I really love that, because it means that I get to see more of the genres I've always loved done in a way that hooks me immediately, and that I want to just go slide into.
Yeah, and again, segueing right into our next question, which is what space operas have you enjoyed recently, or what are you looking forward to reading from your mountainous TBR piles? Everina, you want to take it first?
Yeah, so I have two that I've kind of coming to mind. The first one is actually a novella, which I read last year. I think it was published possibly the year before that, which is Sisters of the Vast Black by Lena Rather. Yes. So the concept of this novella is that it is a convent ship of nuns in space, and their convent is a ship, and also their ship is a living bioship. And these are all, concepts that you can come across in other places. The really interesting thing for me that this novella did was it's not Catholicism analog in space, which I think is actually something most of us would reach for instinctively first. This is actually Catholicism in space. And the author has done the work of, as we were talking about before, not just saying, well, what if things were like this, but saying, I'm going to take this one thing from old Earth and I'm going to go through it step by step by step by step until I have this very, very believable version of what would happen if we started from now and then we went to space and Catholicism was there all the time. And you have dealing with how would the church have changed? How would the church have stayed the same? What new problems do you have when you are trying to fit bioships into your Catholic concept of the universe? And not from a sense of, not from a black and white sense of, oh, everything is bad or oh, everything is good, from a sense of people in the church nowadays do an awful lot of thinking about complex theological matters. So what if that complex theological matter was a bioship and colonies? And it was refreshing for me. It was something I hadn't come across before. It's a short book. I will content warning, there is a plague, but I think it's really, really interesting. And the other one is actually coming out later this year, which is A Light from Uncommon Stars, which is a book about mainly present day set, but has about kind of 30% space opera, about a violin teacher who has made a Faustian bargain where she needs to send 7 of her brilliant handpicked students to hell, and she has already sent 6 of them. And she meets this kind of young trans girl who's brilliant at music, and it's about it's a really nice story about found family, redemption and that kind of thing. But 30% of it is there is also a starship captain. And I just love that you can just drop in a starship captain, and the starship captain is just here, and she has her own plot line, and she's she gets together with the violin teacher. It's just the kind of other end of the spectrum of what if you just had fun with space opera? What if you just dropped in all those things?
That's really neat. Now I want to read that, especially because my whole family, aside from me, are classical musicians. So that is either going to be amazing, or I'm going to be like, oh my God, that's not how that works at it. And I don't know which, and I hope it's the first one.
No, it's very, very good. I'm an ex-violinist, and it's the violin.
Okay, yeah. Yeah. So I think actually the recent space opera I want to talk about is by Max Gladstone, and it's called Empress of Forever. And it fits with the sort of general theme of this panel because its main character is a queer woman. And oh, is she complicated? I love her. She's a terrible person, which makes me really enjoy the process of her realizing that she's a terrible person and trying to figure out what she's going to do about that, because it's not a straightforward redemption arc at all. So Max has kind of written a combination of what if we grabbed a lesbian version of Elon Musk and threw her into an anime version of Journey to the West. What would happen? How badly would it go? And it is so gonzo, and it is so also completely rooted in character and relationships at the same time. And I adore it. I think it's one of the most original things I've read in a long time. And Max has this, he's a friend, so he has this terrible habit of making me briefly believe in Buddhism. Like, he's that good. He can get me slightly woo Jewish person who's like really into being Jewish to get the whole like dissolve of the self into the collective and why that's good. Yeah, okay. He's brilliant.
Yeah, those are some awesome stories, and yeah, I've heard of certainly all three of them, and Max of course has so many. His craft sequences is awesome too. But yeah, those are some excellent titles coming out. We are now 20 minutes from the end, and so what we will do is we will turn to audience questions. So if you have questions, we've got 2 so far, please feel free to submit more, and we will get into as many as we can. So the first question that came in is actually for Everina specifically. One of the things which changed between the Course of Honor and Winter's Orbit was the description of gender markers used by each social group. We're adding those details a deliberate choice, which would I'm trying to parse the question for the later version, or something which had already been percolating for you. So is that one of the things that you had in here but wasn't on the page, or is it something that you modified to be different in the second version for reasons?
Oh, this is a really good question. So for people who haven't read either of the drafts, in the published version of Winter's Orbit, there is a galactic, so kind of like universal, only some people don't use it, system where if it's based on ornamentation, and people are kind of conditioned to look out for ornaments, and if you're wearing kind of obvious wooden ornaments, you are presenting as a man. If you are wearing obvious flint ornaments, you're presenting as a woman, and if you're wearing obvious glass ornaments, you're presenting as non-binary. In the previous version, which was called Course of Honor, the gender system was actually the same, except it wasn't based on ornaments. It was based on hair and hair braiding. Crucial piece of context here, I think, is I wrote this book 5 years ago. In one way, it has been 5 years in edits because of the weird way it came out. I think definitely during those 5 years, I became more aware that hair is quite a weighted cultural thing, and actually maybe that wasn't the best place for gender presentation to happen. So I moved to this new system. I think because as well as more world building, the other edit was have more of an explanation of the current world building. So where something is literally half a sentence in Course of Honor, it might get like a couple of paragraphs in a couple of places in Winter's Orbit, and then people may pick up on it in Winter's Orbit when in my head it's in Course of Honor, but actually it's implied in half a sentence. So I can point to it and go, yes, but this is very clearly, because of course, there's like 130,000 words in that book. Nobody has read all of them. We all skip. So in my head, it's the same. What I think inevitably happened is that as I added more of those paragraphs, it got more defined, and perhaps there were spaces within that system where the reader was forced to make assumptions, where lots of people were making different assumptions, which I kind of wrangled into, no, you must look at it this way, this is the way the world building is. And I think as I'm writing another book in the same universe at the moment, I think as the universe expands, I'm excited to add more kind of, not more space, but more kind of variation, to say this is not a simplistic one system fits everyone. It's just that it wasn't a big deal for the main character of the previous book. So they didn't think that much about it except to say this is how the standard thing works. So I think I'm excited to add more nuance to it in future books. But in my head it is the same basic system as happened in the first draft. I hope that answers the question.
I think so. I think that covers all of it, and it's cool that you were able to, because you had already written it once and then we're getting it edited and going back, you were able to make those kinds of additions and changes, because then it does build out things more, and then you can keep exploring it further. So that's super awesome. Okay, so now we have a question for Arkady. that Marissa says that she didn't know you were Jewish, and would you like to talk a little bit about Judaism influencing your writing, your style, or anything like that? Or if not, we can move on to the next question.
Sure. I mean, it's going to be a fairly brief discussion because I have yet to write a book that like has Judaism as a central theme. I think I'd like to someday. I haven't done it yet. It's where you can spot it in my work is in terms of considerations of ethics. I think that my ethical system is very much shaped by my being Jewish and what elements of Jewish practice I do in my life. So the solutions I come to for characters and the ones that I feel are right decisions and the ones that are dubious decisions are often influenced by, I guess, my conception of one of the fundamental nature of the universe is that you're allowed to argue with God, and that's like important. And if you don't do it, you're kind of falling down on the job. So in that sense, it's very much part of my writing, but in the sense of exploring Jewish practice specifically, I haven't done that yet. I probably will someday.
Yeah, if you've got the Byzantine Empire, then you can definitely see that coming through too as well. All right. So the next question is for both of you. What are your favorite things about interweaving interpersonal relationships and space opera politics? Also, are you ready for the rise of gay space politicians as a major subgenre? Okay, who wants to take that one first? Because I feel like either of you would be great for this.
I'll jump in first.
Go for it.
Yeah, so I think the great thing about politics is, as Arkady was talking about in one of her previous answers about how do you get here from there, about the kind of complexity and the kind of fractal nature of everything is so complicated, and science fiction will not let you forget that. I think politics is one really great way to kind of proxy that, because I have this thing of humans in groups, especially humans in organizations, do not behave the way that individual humans behave. So you have an organization that is made up of like 20,000 people or whatever, and the things that it does and the decisions that it makes are very different from what two people would do. And I think that can be a really good proxy for the complexity of societies, which I don't think is, so complexity of societies as a whole, I don't think is a subject that you can kind of put in your bucket and make a book about, unless you are very good at that kind of chaos theory. But with politicians, you can have this, you have your personal relationship, which is working one way and has one set of stakes. And then you have your relationship with this organization, with this political body, with this polity, with this entity, with this state, that is playing out with a very different set of stakes. And the entities within it are behaving differently. It's almost like you have an alien and a human, you have a polity and a human, and then you have a human and a human at the same time. And I think the way that that interacts in almost a triangle is just a really interesting, like, you know, gay or not, I'm queer, I like stories about queer people. But I think that's where the interest bit is for me.
That's one of the best conceptualizations of that I've ever heard, and I want to steal it, basically. So, yeah, I love writing politics because politics is people. Politics is always people. It is people all the way down. I mean, I work in politics at my day job, and that is all people. It is all getting the right people to talk to each other at the right moment. And in some ways that's transactional, but in a lot of ways it's how do different people communicate with each other and how do they make each other feel? And how do you negotiate a coalition out of a whole lot of disparate interests, which are both personal, ideological, entity-oriented, and oh my God, this is the most fertile ground for fiction. You can spin plot out of politics without even working very hard. And actually for me, when I was learning to write novels, and A Memory Called Empire was actually the first novel I ever wrote, because I'm not good at them. I mean, I guess I'm good at them, but I'm not. It's hard. Plot is the hardest thing. A plot that will last that many words. How many words are in a novel? Too many words are in a novel. So politics will spin up your plot forever and ever and ever, because people don't stop wanting things even when they get what they asked for. And in politics, they have a lot of levers to get what they asked for or ask for more or less. So in terms of gay space politicians, I mean, hey, sure, go for it. But I think as a queer person who likes reading about queer people, what I really care about is that queer people get to have all of the stories, all of the different kinds. So yeah, there's queer politicians, there's queer politicians who do awful things, there's straight politicians who do awful things, there's straight politicians who are awesome. Like, I want all of it. And I think this is why I initially, to go back to the very first question we were talking about, gravitated toward a queer norm world, is that I want queer people to have every single story open without any particular limitation due to the fact that they are queer.
I like that we're just nodding. All right. Like, yes, exactly. All right. So we have one more question, and then depending on time, I may throw an extra one in there, and if not, we will wind down and reintroduce ourselves and head out. So this question is, what do you think of stories that dig into fundamentally different types of life or intelligence? For example, aliens that are difficult for humans to understand on even a basic level because they're so wholly different from how humans look, think, and behave.
I feel like this is a question I should be like, hi, I wrote this book. Deeply fascinating, love them, have always loved them, have worked really hard to make really alien aliens, as alien as I can get them. And yeah, it just, all of the questions about identity and humanity that you can do with humans, you can do sharper and stranger by putting humans next to non-humans.
I'm having tech problems.
Oh, ooh.
Oh,
well, we can hear you. All right.
Excellent. Right. Sorry.
Oh, so go ahead, Everina. Your turn.
Yes, I'm getting very broken up audio to me, but as long as you can hear me, that's fine.
Yes.
Please wave at me to stop me. Yeah, so Arkady's a much better person to answer this because Arkady's books have aliens in them. And mine do not have aliens in them, or at least not current extant aliens that you can talk to. My feeling in this is the same as we are not writing space opera that is a wholehearted guess of, I think we will definitely be here 2,000 years in the future. We are instead looking at chaos theory and just throwing it out the window and saying, well, what if this happened, in a way that says more about current society. In the same way, I think that with aliens, we are also not saying this is what I think aliens will be like. We are saying, what if aliens were like this? And the way in which we say this is in a very human-centric way. What we think those aliens will highlight will say about humans, because I really believe that if you go very, very, very alien with your aliens, in a way that bears no relationship to humans and some relationship to science thinks that we may find these very, very weird creatures, then you are either writing a horror story in that we can't recognize anything about this other form of life, or you are writing very, very kind of experimental science fiction in the very, very true sense of the term, in how would we react to something we can't communicate with. Once you have aliens which are close enough to humans that you can write a story about them. I think we are essentially writing about humans in reaction to those aliens, and I think those, and that is really, really interesting to me, because what are you saying that are our basic assumptions about being human that you are now challenging with these aliens? And of course, if your aliens are blue-skinned humans, then you're not really challenging any basic assumptions. But if you dig into them, it can get really, really interesting. And that's, I think, probably all I have to say about that. As I say, no aliens currently in my book.
I think that is a great point, though, about what basics. Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, you were talking about like the kind of books that turn into horror stories because of the realization that you cannot communicate with the forms of life. And I just kind of want to recommend Peter Watts's Blind Sight to everybody, with the enormous content warning that you'll kind of want to jump off a bridge afterward. But it's a great book. But it's that question. The what if it's not possible at all, and what if trying is a terrible idea?
Yeah. Oh no, you're good. We're all being quiet now. So we have about 4 minutes left. I'm not sure how much, if that is enough time to get back to anything that was discussed before, because we have talked about so much and such great things. If anyone has any last questions, this is your last chance to get them in. But maybe like, is there any popular media type space opera right now that you are finding interesting or engaging in, The Expanse or something like that?
I am a terrible person who doesn't watch television much at all. So the last popular media space opera that I loved was Farscape, which is so close to my heart. I love that show. But that's from the late 90s, early 2000s. So yeah, I'm not the right person to ask.
It's such a good show, though.
Yeah.
Everina, anything?
Sorry, I think I may have missed the question. Sorry.
No problem. Just if there were any sort of more popular culture, TV, movie, space operas that you've been engaging with lately.
Oh, so lately I don't. Again, I have not watched a whole lot of TV lately. The last sci-fi thing I think I watched was Kipo and the Age of Wonder Beast, which is an animated series on Netflix. I watched it last year, and it's kind of near future sci-fi, and it has it's just very fun and very joyous, and what we would probably call in the 90s wacky. I don't know if we still use that word anymore. I haven't talked to human Dave 20 years, it's fine. And I think what was fun for me about it was, again, watching it with my girlfriend, who has strong opinions about medical bioethics, and these children's TV characters making some bioethics decisions about whether or not to make giant mutant animals, and picking apart those from an ethical committee standpoint. Was great fun. No, it's a good series. I do recommend it.
It is truly a delightful series. It is very fun. I have the benefit of having children, and so I have the grown-up cover of, oh yeah, no, my kids are watching it. Yeah, as if I care. But that was a delightful one, certainly. And I feel like there is kind of a renaissance of really amazing cartoons out there right now. You've got stuff like She-Ra, you've got Glitch Techs, you've got Kipo and the Age of the Wonder Beast, which is just, there's so much delightful stuff. Anyway, we are now coming to the end of our panel. We are officially just about out of time. And so what I'd like for you to do is tell the people where they can find you online, where they can find your books, where your websites are, where your Twitters are, etc., and just kind of reintroduce yourselves as our outro here. Everina, would you like to go first, please?
Cool, yes. So my Twitter is av_stories, that's AV_stories. And I'm on Instagram as Everina_Maxwell. And my book is Winter's Orbit.
And I am on Twitter as @Arkady Martine, which is simple. And I am on Instagram, but always forget to use it as Bezantienne, which is spelled Bezant and then the French feminine ending. And I have a website which is also fairly straightforward. It is www.arkadymartine.net, and I need to update it. So yeah, the easiest way to find me is actually Twitter. And my book that came out last month is A Desolation Called Peace, which is the sequel to A Memory Called Empire.
Yeah, all extremely excellent books. And I have been your host very quickly, Valerie Valdes. I am Valerie Valdes on Twitter. That is with an S if you are listening and not writing, not watching. But feel free to find me online as well. I'm the author of Chilling Effect of Prime Deceptions. And thank you so, so much for coming to this panel. Hope you had an excellent time and learned as much as I did. And please do go buy the books of our lovely panelists and enjoy the rest of the San Antonio Book Festival. Thank you, everyone.